Why are Amazon orders getting canceled mid-ocean? Why did shipping costs from Shanghai to Long Beach triple in 10 days? Why are US car factories shutting down over $12 chips again? And most of all, why is China now warning the United States that it's ready to fight any type of war? This isn't just inflation. It's not a pandemic hangover. And it's certainly not a coincidence. This is a tactical takedown of America's supply chains, launched not with missiles, but with memos. Quiet memos, no headlines, no warnings. Just ports jammed, prices exploding, and factories grinding to a halt. And behind all this punishment to the United States is one country, China. So what really happened? What set it off? And why does this feel like the beginning of something much bigger? In this video, let's find out. It didn't come with a bang. It came with a whisper. On April 1, 2025, former President Donald Trump stood at a podium in front of a flag-draped warehouse in Pennsylvania and proudly declared what he called the Second Liberation Day of American industry. With all the fireworks of a campaign stunt, he slapped a 145% tariff on over $300 billion worth of Chinese imports, claiming this would force Beijing to the table and protect American workers. His supporters cheered. Headlines exploded. But across the Pacific, Beijing didn't respond with noise. China retaliated, but with silence. Cold, calculated silence. Just 2 days later, on April 3rd, Chinese authorities issued a discreet internal directive to all state-affiliated airlines: suspend all new Boeing aircraft deliveries indefinitely. No press conferences, no dramatic announcements. Just a single stroke of the bureaucratic pen that sent shockwaves through the U.S. economy. $28.4 billion was wiped off Boeing's valuation in 48 hours. One of America's crown jewels in manufacturing, a global export icon, was suddenly bleeding on the floor, and Beijing didn't fire a single shot. But this wasn't arbitrary. According to a leaked Ministry of Commerce memo obtained by the South China Morning Post, the move wasn't an economic protest. It was strategic warfare. The memo called the aircraft freeze a calibrated retaliation, not against tariffs per se, but against what China called targeted humiliation of Chinese export dignity. And that's exactly what this was. Retaliation through symbolic targeting. Boeing was not just an aircraft company. It was a diplomatic currency. Planes weren't just sold. They were trusted, leveraged, and used as soft power. Every Boeing plane grounded meant lost jobs in Seattle, dropped stocks in New York, and louder panic in Washington. And China made its message clear without a single bullet point. You target our trade. We will dismantle your industrial identity. The market understood. While Boeing stumbled, Airbus surged, with shares jumping 11.2% in Frankfurt. Chinese airlines, once lined up to receive Dreamliners, pivoted toward European manufacturers without blinking. And at that moment, the reality dawned in the Trump camp. Not only had the trade war failed to scare China, but the US had just handed Beijing the playbook for how to win. And China had only played its opening move. However, if grounding Boeing was the surgical strike, what followed was the economic siege. China didn't need warships or embargoes. All it needed to do was stop the flow of goods, and that's exactly what it did. While American pundits applauded Trump's tariffs as patriotic, Chinese logistics networks quietly began cutting the oxygen lines of global trade. Within 72 hours of Trump's tariff bombshell, the ripple effects hit the ports. The Shanghai International Port Group reported a 47% drop in outbound container volume to the U.S. by April 4th. In Ningbo, China's second-largest port, over 71,000 containers sat idle, baking under the spring sun for over 10 days, with some shipments still labeled as awaiting clearance, a bureaucratic black hole designed to freeze trade without technically banning it. In Shenzhen, Major freight companies like Ziteo Express and Costco Shipping began canceling U.S.-bound contracts, not out of protest, but fear. Fear of retroactive tariff exposure, a legal ambiguity created by Trump's erratic policy that meant a company could be taxed mid-transit, mid-invoice, or even mid-ocean. "You can't price a shipment when the rules change mid-ocean," said Jiang Qing, a logistics director at Sotrans. "It's not shipping anymore. It's roulette." Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, California ports began to drown. At the Port of Los Angeles, already fragile from post-COVID recovery, 27 vessels waited offshore. Unloading times ballooned to 96 hours. Stacks of unclaimed cargo clogged storage yards. By April 10th, the cost of shipping a single 40-foot container from Shanghai to Long Beach had exploded from $1,950 to $6,820, according to the Freightos Baltic Index. That's a 250% increase in 10 days. And this wasn't just about delays. This was weaponized congestion. The arteries of U.S. trade were clogged with no surgical remedy. Even large corporations couldn't get guaranteed slots. Walmart, Five Below, Target, and Amazon began freezing inbound China shipments. Retailers started trimming their summer inventories, and for the first time since the pandemic, retail panic-buying strategies re-emerged behind closed doors. But here's the kicker. The ports were never formally closed. There was no embargo, no official blockade. Just uncertainty. And in global trade, uncertainty is the most expensive commodity on Earth. Factories don't run on faith. Retailers don't restock on hope. Ports don't schedule guesses. By shutting down predictability, China paralyzed the system and made it look like the U.S. did it to itself. What began as a tariff tantrum was now morphing into a logistics collapse, one where the West Coast choked, the East Coast scrambled, and Middle America started running out of parts. And this is where the disaster leapt from the ports to the factory floors. The ports froze, cargo collapsed, U.S. shelves began to thin. But for a week, China maintained silence, letting Washington sweat over the consequences of its own tariffs. And then, the silence broke. On April 9th, the Chinese embassy in Washington reposted a defiant statement that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. "If war is what the U.S. wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we are ready to fight till the end." This wasn't just a flex. It was a declaration. A transformation from economic chess to all-out confrontation. The gloves were off, and Beijing wasn't bluffing anymore. China immediately escalated the trade retaliation by slapping 10 to 15% tariffs on key American agricultural exports, soybeans, pork, and corn, targeting regions where Trump had once drawn his strongest support. But what came next made it clear that this wasn't just about soybeans or steel. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, and current affairs impacting your lives. At the National People's Congress, Premier Li Qiang announced a fresh 7.2% increase in defense spending, a signal to both domestic and foreign audiences that China wasn't just preparing for tariff battles. It was gearing up for long-term strategic competition across military, economic, and technological lines. To the world it was, "We won't be cornered." To Chinese citizens, it was reassurance that their government could navigate this storm and come out stronger. And to Washington, it was a direct response to Trump's unpredictable, punishing tariff hikes. You want a trade war? We'll match it. You want an economic siege? We're already building the fortress. This strategic posture caught the U.S. off guard. Because while Washington was still celebrating its tariff toughness, Beijing was moving industries, tightening logistics control, and locking down strategic resources. But China wasn't done. It had applied pressure globally. Now it was time to watch American corporations crack from the inside. The declaration from Beijing was still rippling through headlines when the first American corporate retreat began. Amazon. Just hours after China's defiant post, Amazon's global supply chain division sent out an emergency notice. All incoming shipments from mainland China were suspended. They cited the unpredictable tariff environment and warehouse space volatility. But between the lines, it was panic. That panic spread like wildfire through U.S. retail. Five Below, a company that thrives on low-cost imports, abruptly canceled $67 million worth of Chinese goods already mid-transit. Not a delay, a cancellation of in-motion freight. Target and Dollar General followed, slashing Q2 orders in a quiet but coordinated retreat from the chaos. Retailers weren't just avoiding tariffs. They were trying to outrun the collapse. The data backed the fear. Consumer sentiment nosedived. The University of Michigan's April index dropped to 75.1, the lowest since the height of the COVID crisis. And as everyday Americans stared down rising prices and empty shelves, the storm jumped from retail to manufacturing, America's industrial engine. First to fall, Ford. Its flagship, F-150 Lightning production line in Michigan went dark, crippled by a missing batch of microcontrollers trapped in Chinese ports. Then came GM in Tennessee, reporting a 60% slowdown in battery production. Without imported capacitors and inverters, EV lines ground to a halt. And it wasn't just about delays. It was rerouting production entirely. Stellantis dropped the hammer. Several U.S. models would move to Mexican facilities until tariff conditions stabilize. In other words, the U.S. just made itself too expensive to operate in. By the second week of April, over 41,000 vehicles had been cut from production in the U.S., translating to $1.6 billion in lost revenue. And this time, it wasn't because of a chip shortage or global demand slump. It was because Washington couldn't stop waging war on its own supply chain. Dealerships slashed inventory, wholesale prices spiked, and companies began cannibalizing units for parts. A desperate move not seen since the darkest days of the pandemic. And through all this, China remained calm. It had already picked its targets. It was watching the fallout. And most of all, it was controlling the tempo of the trade war. What had started as a bold American tariff move was now a Chinese playbook in motion, and Wall Street, Main Street, and Detroit were all learning what it meant when Beijing stopped warning and started acting. But the worst may not come from ports or products. After weeks of economic pain, factory shutdowns, skyrocketing container costs, and mass inventory cancellations, the pressure inside Washington reached a boiling point. The trade war had stopped being a political stunt and started becoming an economic disaster. Trump, who had once boasted that trade wars were easy to win, now found himself surrounded by panicked CEOs, spooked investors, and a fractured Republican donor base. By mid-April, the political cost had become too high to ignore, and for the first time, the president began to backpedal. On April 14th, the Wall Street Journal reported that the White House was considering slashing tariffs on Chinese goods by as much as 50%. Trump didn't frame it as surrender. He wrapped it in vague optimism and familiar promises, telling reporters, "We're going to have a fair deal with China. The tariffs will come down substantially." But nobody missed the subtext. This was a walk back, a retreat, a climb down. And China didn't miss it either. Markets responded instantly. The Nasdaq surged by 4%, and some of the worst-hit industrial stocks rebounded. But in China, the mood wasn't relaxed. It was a mockery. On Weibo, the phrase, "Trump chickened out," trended across the platform, attached to videos of stranded containers, idle U.S. car plants, and clips of Chinese officials smiling silently at policy meetings. Beijing didn't need to shout its victory. It simply watched the White House retreat, and the world noticed. Even Trump's own Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, softened the administration's stance with a diplomatic mask. At a Washington financial summit, he said, "America first does not mean America alone. We must pursue deeper collaboration and mutual respect among trade partners." It was a carefully worded statement that masked a harsh truth. The tariffs didn't force China to the table. They backed the United States into a corner, and China didn't even need to raise its voice. While Trump scrambled for a way out, Beijing quietly sharpened its next move. As soon as the White House began talking about retreat, China escalated on a different front, one with far deeper consequences. On April 12th, China imposed new export restrictions on dysprosium and terbium, two rare earth elements essential to American electric vehicles, missile guidance systems, and aerospace manufacturing. This was no coincidence. These metals were strategic, and Beijing knew exactly where to hit. The reaction from U.S. industry was immediate. Lockheed Martin issued a warning that missile production timelines would be impacted. Ford announced delays on 2 electric vehicle lines, citing a sudden shortage of critical magnets. GM told Bloomberg, "There's no fast, cheap replacement for what we're now cut off from." China didn't just target the U.S. supply chain. It targeted the parts of it that couldn't pivot fast enough. The strategic sectors too complex and too specialized to be fixed with a domestic workaround. But as damaging as the rare earth restrictions were, the financial move that followed was even more ominous. China quietly reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds to their lowest levels since 2011. There was no press release, no bold announcement, just a slow, deliberate exit. It wasn't just about trade anymore. It was about signaling that Beijing could destabilize not only America's supply lines, but also its currency foundations. In a world where the dollar underpins global trade, any erosion of confidence in the U.S. Treasury bonds sends shockwaves through international markets. And China, holding over $1.1 trillion in U.S. debt, was beginning to twist the knife. This was no longer a tit-for-tat tariff war. It was becoming something more volatile, something more dangerous. A currency war where the value of the dollar itself could become a geopolitical weapon. And for the first time in decades, America had no ready response. As the dust settles and leaders on both sides regroup, one thing has become painfully clear. This isn't just a supply chain disruption. It's a structural breakdown. It's fragmentation. And it's happening in real time. China's message has been loud and unmissable. We won't be bullied, we won't be bought, and we won't be blocked. The United States, once the architect of global trade, now finds itself fighting on terms it doesn't control, reacting to shocks rather than delivering them. From Tesla to Lockheed, from Amazon to Walmart, everyone is rewriting the rule book. Not because they want to, but because they have no choice. Who do you think will win the trade war between the United States and China? Do you feel China was preparing for Trump's comeback for years and has the strength to launch a full-blown war? In the comment section below, share your thoughts on whether Trump made a massive mistake by angering China. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, changing world order, and current affairs. Things you need to stay informed. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.